Can Rishi Sunak shake off the sleaze? Two new crises threaten his promise to restore integrity.
Your tax affairs a distraction for the party, Mr Zahawi?
Case 1, his party chairman and former Chancellor admits being careless with his tax, reportedly repaying £5 million.
It's important that we answer these questions, we get to the bottom of these things, because integrity and accountability is really important to me.
Why does the Prime Minister need an advisor to tell him that this conduct is unethical?
Case 2, claims over the links between Boris Johnson and the BBC chairman he appointed and a loan of £800,000. Both cases now subject of inquiry. So where does it leave the PM's promises of change? Anushka and Robert will join us. Also on News at 10.
Alexa, kitchen lights off.
OK. Did you switch off tonight? Why the National Grid paid $1 million Brits to cut their energy use. What lies beneath the happy images of Chinese New Year? Debbie on the regime's digital crackdown on any dissent.
也就是说，当大家看到这段视频的时候，我已经被警察带走了。
Why Ellie Downey, Olympic gymnast, is quitting the sport she loves after blowing the whistle on abuse.
But ultimately, they were having such an impact on my mental health. I knew I just needed to be happy and find my happiness again.
And the mother of all film roles, with the Oscars in sight, Michelle Williams on what it's like to play Steven Spielberg's mum.
You know, having the person who lived through it behind the monitor, you would always hear him say, "I have an idea." And the man has so many ideas.
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. When only last month Rishi Sunak ended the 6-month vacancy for an ethics advisor, it was seen as part of his pledge to lead a government with integrity and accountability. But the man appointed, Sir Laurie Magnus, could hardly have imagined he'd be called upon so soon, charged with investigating the Conservative Party chairman, no less, the one-time Chancellor Nadhim Zahawi. He, it's claimed, had made a £5 million settlement with the taxman, part of which was a penalty, something even Mr Sunak says he knew nothing about when he defended him in the Commons just last week. It makes the Prime Minister's admission today that there are questions to answer seem something of an understatement. And all the while, this and a separate row over the appointment of the BBC chairman are major distractions from dealing with the bitter realities of life being faced by millions.
Rishi Sunak promised to be different, to put sleaze to bed.
This government will have integrity.
And yet, since that opening pitch just 13 weeks ago, there have been bullying allegations leading one minister, Gavin Williamson, to resign and forcing another, Deputy PM Dominic Raab, to face an investigation. Now there are two more probes, one into the appointment of BBC Chair Richard Sharp and
Your tax affairs a distraction for the party, Mr Zahawi?
into the tax affairs of the man in charge of Conservative Party finances, its chair, Nadhim Zahawi. After it emerged that he'd paid back millions of pounds in unpaid tax to HMRC, Rishi Sunak, visiting a hospital in Northampton, said his ethics advisor would investigate. But he's not sacking him.
He will continue to do his job, but it's important that we answer these questions and we get to the bottom of these things, because integrity and accountability is really important to me. But I also think dealing with these things professionally is the right approach.
The controversy starts in May 2000 when Nadhim Zahawi co-founded the polling company YouGov. Instead of keeping hold of founder shares, he placed them in an offshore fund called Balshore Investments, controlled by his parents. Tax experts claimed that meant avoiding tax. In July 2018, Balshore Investments sold shares in YouGov worth £27 million. In July 2022, Mr Zahawi was appointed Chancellor by Boris Johnson, despite officials flagging his tax affairs. A month later, he reportedly paid back HMRC £4.8 million, including a penalty. This weekend, he said the error that led to that was careless and not deliberate. Mr Zahawi says he's confident he acted properly throughout, but he's facing massive political pressure.
Why Why does the Prime Minister need an advisor to tell him that this conduct is unethical?
Yeah. There's a sense that the BBC itself has to be more competitive.
And now another headache. An investigation into allegations that BBC Chair Richard Sharp helped Boris Johnson secure a loan of up to £800,000 just before the then PM recommended him for this role.
How do you feel about these revelations?
I was surprised, like everyone else involved in the process, because we'd known that Richard Sharp was a strong Tory supporter and donor and a friend of the Prime Minister. But this particular aspect of it was completely unknown to those involved in the appointment.
Allies of Mr Sunak, who want the focus to be on jobs and growth, are frustrated about the pressure over things that happened before his time.
But Rishi Sunak can't easily point the finger angrily back at Boris Johnson because of the ripples it would create in this place, in Parliament, where there are dozens of Conservative MPs who think the former PM should still be in place.
Hi.
After a police fine for failing to wear a seatbelt, it's been a tough few days for the PM. But in Downing Street, they insist he is acting with integrity by facing the challenges head-on. Anushka Rastana, News at 10.
And Robert is here. Tough few days, bit of an understatement really with this, isn't it? So the Prime Minister has taken the decision to refer the matter of Nadeem Zahawi to the independent ethics advisor instead of sacking him. What do you think his prospects are?
So for me, the material issue is whether Nadeem Zahawi misled in his public statements, because ministers are not supposed to do that, and equally how open and transparent he was about the conflict of interest as Chancellor that he had in negotiating a tax settlement with HMRC, how open and transparent he was about that with officials at the Cabinet Office and at the Treasury itself, the then permanent secretary. And so talking to officials tonight, I have to say, I think they feel they weren't kept in the loop as much as they should have been by Mr Zahawi. That would be one breach of the ministerial code. And separately, he did repeatedly say, this is Nadeem Zahawi, in public statements either issued by himself directly or by his advisers, that his tax affairs were up to date and that he didn't benefit from an offshore trust. Now, as we've just seen from Anushka's film, the HMRC settlement in itself basically says his tax affairs to the tune of many millions were not up to date, and indeed that he did benefit from an offshore trust. So it looks as though those public statements were misleading. And again, ministers of the Crown, it's a breach of the ministerial code if you mislead the media in that way. I think there is a reasonable chance, I wouldn't say more than that he will have to resign.
And what about the Prime Minister himself? I mean, that's just one of a stack of problems that he's dealing with at the moment, having stood there and promised professionalism, accountability, integrity, crucially. How difficult is it for him now? Well, it is difficult. He stood on the steps of Downing Street and said he would behave in a more scrupulous way. His defenders, his advisers would say, well, look, he is not trying to sweep this under the carpet. He has referred it to a new independence ethics advisor and he's doing exactly what he promised. If at the end of that the world is convinced that there's not a cover-up and, you know, that could mean Zahawi going or not going, then I think, you know, Sunak emerges from that damaged because, frankly, any minister in your team who has to resign in these circumstances, if he does resign, that's an embarrassment. But you know, Sunak will be able to say, look, I followed the rules. OK. Robert, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, while the Prime Minister was facing complex questions over his judgment, there was another much simpler question being asked on today's picket lines, namely, where is he? As bitter pay disputes rumble on with still no sign of resolution. Today, nearly 20,000 ambulance workers walked out across England and Wales. For many areas across both nations, the third day of such strikes in 5 weeks. And there are 2 more scheduled for tomorrow and for a fortnight's time. Unions have not named a specific pay demand, but say they want an above-inflation rise to stave off what they call a staff exodus. The government has described that as unaffordable and has offered far less, on average a rise of just under 5% to all NHS staff in England and Wales.
It looks like we'll all have to get used to this. Ambulance workers striking in England and Wales. And until the government sits down and talks about pay, it'll happen again and again.
We thought that there would be resolution by now, but Rishi Sunak is literally missing in action. Where is he? Why is he not taking responsibility for this dispute? He needs to come back to the negotiating table, get this sorted out. He's the leader of the country, so these people can go back to work.
This is where the Prime Minister was in Northampton, meeting mental health leaders as he announced how £150 million would be spent to help improve their services. I asked him why he wasn't negotiating.
So when it comes to unions, what the government did at the beginning of this year is invite all union leaders from across the public sector to come in and have talks with their respective secretaries of state, and that's the right approach.
The unions have said that they will negotiate, they will consider 10%. The Welsh and the Scottish Government are negotiating. When will you engage?
The government has been engaging and will continue to always engage.
But not on this year's pay settlement, which is what the unions want.
You know, what all government ministers are doing across the board is engaging with unions on all the things that they want to talk about. And when it comes to pay, those, as I said, those conversations have to be anchored in what's reasonable and fair, what's responsible and affordable.
But surely, Prime Minister, it is only a matter of time, isn't it? At some point, you're going to have to sit down and negotiate.
Well, I think taking a step back, right? Of course, it would be lovely to be able to wave a magic wand and just give everyone what they were demanding when it came to pay. But where's the money going to come from? And actually, it's probably going to have to come from elsewhere in the NHS budget, and that means fewer nurses, fewer doctors.
Is what you're saying then? You are not going to ever sit down and negotiate, even though they have promised to continue striking until you do?
I'm always going to be happy for the government to engage in dialogue with unions. Of course that's the right thing to do, and that's what is happening, has been happening.
What do we want? Fair pay! When do we want it? Now!
The truth is there haven't been any talks with unions for 2 weeks. It means more strike dates will be announced this week, and while the dispute continues, patients face more and more disruption. Emily Morgan, News at 10.
There is something of an irony that the task of keeping the lights on tonight required 1 million of us to pull the plug. Fears of an electricity shortage meant the first live run of a new energy-saving scheme. The idea is to reduce the load on the national grid during peak times by paying households to slash their consumption. This evening, the switch-off lasted an hour. Tomorrow, it's set to run for 90 minutes.
In South Wales this evening, the Chambers family were helping to keep the nation's lights on by switching some of their lights off. Between 5 and 6 o'clock, when power demand was at its highest, their dishwasher and washing machine sat idle. The family were paid £6 for their efforts, but for them it was not just about the money.
For me, it's about the environment and the impact we all have. If we can just think about how we consume energy to help the grid.
National Grid operates our electricity system. It says 1 million households and businesses with smart meters were paid between £2 and £10 by their energy supplier to delay using power today.
The incentives are not massive. They're not going to change your life. But I mean, we've already paid out £1.6 million to our customers that have participated. So this is partly about saving a little bit of money off your bill, but more importantly, it's about contributing to helping our energy system stay in balance over the tight winter.
National Grid estimates it managed to reduce peak energy consumption in that hour this evening by 329 megawatts. That's down just under 1% on what it would have been. How did people cut back? Well, some household appliances use much more electricity than others. Just look at the difference between the estimated single-use costs of a tumble dryer and a television. On the average day in the UK, the power we use comes from a range of sources. 80%, though, is generated by gas, wind and nuclear. But every day we also rely on imports of electricity for around 5% of the power we need. The network was under strain today because the weather was cold, because the wind was weak and because imports were scarce. National Grid has designed the scheme to help avoid blackouts. If it becomes established, the savings could become significant.
We think that if we ran trials like this all through the winter, people could save £100 on their bills easily. So for customers, what they should know is they should expect to see exciting new things coming forward from their suppliers to reward them for doing this kind of thing.
At Selby in North Yorkshire, Drax had 2 coal-fired power stations warmed up and ready to generate electricity today, just in case. In the end, they weren't needed, but they'll be on standby again tomorrow when households and businesses will be asked to cut peak usage again. Joel Hills, News at 10.
Well, it's one thing for households to voluntarily reduce their consumption. It is quite another for vulnerable people to be plunged into the cold and dark. That is the issue at the heart of concerns over widening use of prepayment meters. The regulator, Ofgem, says it will review the process by which energy companies can move customers over. They will focus on forced installations and remote switching, which they say can leave struggling bill payers cut off without warning. And for more details about why prepayment meters are so controversial and what to do if you want to get rid of yours, head to ITVX and scroll down to the news section. For those struggling to keep their energy meters fed, it'll come as no surprise that parts of the country endured their coldest night in more than a decade yesterday. Temperatures at Heathrow Airport dropped to minus 8.4 degrees, the lowest there for any January day since the late 1980s. The icy runways meant dozens of flights had to be delayed or cancelled today. To Ukraine now, where each fresh round of fighting brings fresh pleas for firepower, specifically Kyiv's desire for German-made Leopard tanks, amongst the deadliest and most powerful in the world. For some time, it seemed any decision would depend on Berlin's sign-off, and tonight there are signs that that may eventually come. But regardless, Poland has suggested it will find a way to support and supply its war-torn neighbour.
The streets of Bakhmut tell of fierce battles, barely a building without scar. Even the military's vehicle sports its own damage from months of combat. Such images, along with knowledge they are only a border apart, are driving Poland's wish to supply Ukraine with tanks, which could help defend and reclaim its land. Today, the Polish Prime Minister insisted he wouldn't necessarily wait for Germany's say-so. These are the tanks the Polish PM wishes to see crossing the border, with or without German approval. Today, he suggested his government would make a formal request for German permission to share their tanks, but should it not be forthcoming, would build a coalition of the willing to ensure the Ukrainians get them anyway. The Germans are still considering their position, fearful of escalation. However, the foreign minister has suggested they wouldn't actively refuse an export request. It's thought there are around 2,000 of the German-made Leopard tanks worldwide. Poland has 247, and Finland has around 200, with half of them in storage. Both countries say they'd send tanks to Ukraine. Germany has 521 Leopards, including 200 in storage. As they hold the export licence, they have the right to say which non-NATO countries gets to have them. The Ukrainians do have some tanks, but mainly older Soviet ones. The Leopards would give them advantage on the ground.
They are good tanks. They're effective tanks, and they will make a difference on the battlefield, and certainly help the Ukrainians to either to deal with what looks like a potential Russian advance later in the next 3 to 5 months, or if they want to conduct their own advance, then they're better equipped so to do as well.
There seems little doubt an advance is coming. What remains unclear is exactly what Ukraine will have in its armoury when it does. Emma Murphy, News at 10.
With a population of well over 1 billion, it is no small task monitoring the internet activity of everyone in China. But having just about survived a wave of lockdown protests, authorities there are desperate to avoid any further display of dissent. They've ordered a clampdown on social media to stamp out anything other than New Year joy. Big Brother, we're told, lurks not just in surveillance cameras, but in 1 billion pockets across the land.
From the cute, choreographed children performing on the grand gala stage to spectacular street shows, these are the joyful images China wants the world to see. Even its Lunar New Year celebrations are being censored. Only happy families and cheerful messages will make it past teams at the powerful Cyberspace Administration who are monitoring social media. Online clean-up campaigns are not unusual during the national holiday, but this year all the details were made public, and the crackdown is clearly designed to prevent any dissent that might fuel further protests. There are still police cars stationed at the scene of the November demonstrations, which led to the collapse of the government's zero-COVID policy. On the surface, life in the capital has returned to normal, but the authorities remain on edge.
After the white paper movement, no matter how quiet on the surface is, in the coming months or even years, but China is already a different China.
Xiao Chang runs the China Digital Times, which tracks Chinese censorship and online sentiment. He believes President Xi Jinping is facing a similar challenge from today's young generation.
Because they have just witnessed how terrifying if you let one person to be concentrated so much power, and the draconian zero COVID policy and its disaster brought on China is actually a most clear evidence that wakening people up.
But digital surveillance has allowed the authorities to track down and arrest dozens of those who took part in last year's demonstrations. Sal Jasin is one of many who have disappeared into detention. She left this video for friends to release, knowing officers were closing in.
也就是说，当大家看到这段视频的时候，我已经被警察带走了。
In China, phones can leave an easy trail for the police to follow. Eric Liu describes them as the spy in everyone's pocket. He used to work on the censorship team of the country's top messaging platform.
微博上有很多纳粹的言论。
On Weibo, there were many Nazi, racist and sexist comments, but what we censors focused on was the so-called political topics. What I worked on was pretty bad, following instructions to deprive people of their rights.
From the start of this year, the government imposed a new law requiring internet companies to proofread all posts on their site. They already have a legal obligation to hand over the details of individual users. Xiao Chang thinks we will see further controls imposed in the coming months.
It's always about restriction. It's about eliminate the ability of Chinese people's agency to speak, to act, to move, in order to protect the regime itself, what Xi Jinping called a regime security.
At this annual time of reflection, the Chinese government is working harder than ever to make sure this doesn't become a new year of rebellion. Debbie Edward, News at 10.
For all her hours of hard work across 20 years of training, the gymnast Ellie Downey reflected today that her routines each lasted barely a couple of minutes. What will last far longer is the impact she's had on her sport. It was, after all, her allegations that helped us expose a culture of fear and emotional abuse within British gymnastics. But announcing her retirement today, the 23-year-old said it was time to prioritise her happiness.
One of Britain's most decorated gymnasts, Ellie Downey, has quit at just 23. She says because of her treatment by some of those who run the sport.
It's sad that it's kind of come to this, and didn't think it really would. But ultimately, they were having such an impact on my mental health. I knew I just needed to be happy and find my happiness again, and they were taking that away from me.
Along with her sister Becky, Ellie was one of the first gymnasts to speak publicly about the sport's toxic culture. She believes that cost her selection for major competitions.
The repercussions were quite obvious. Even though people told me they didn't have a problem with it, actions speak louder than words, and the actions I received weren't good. It was almost being ignored, or kind of just not making it clear that they didn't want me on a team.
Like so many others, the former European champion says gymnastics' obsession with weight has left her with an unhealthy relationship with food.
You can't possibly be overweight. We were training so intensely from such a young age. But I guess just to have that kind of forced on you from so young, it obviously will stay with you for a lot of your life, or it will take a lot to kind of shift it from your mindset.
British Gymnastics said today Ellie has been a tremendous ambassador for the sport, and in speaking up about her experiences has been part of helping us to reform the sport. We've spoken with her in depth and are committed to continuing to do so. She's raised issues that we are already aware of and are being addressed.
I definitely do want to stay in the sport. It's not ruined my love for the sport at all. It's just a shame that some of the people that are in it don't know how to treat people with respect and just value them and take care of your athletes sometimes.
When Ellie Downey spoke out, she became a catalyst for change. Now, as a new coach, more than 2 years after that bravery, she continues to be part of gymnastics' solution. Steve Scott, News at 10.
In the fickle world of football, the fall from favour can be relatively swift. It was less than a year ago that Frank Lampard arrived at Everton as manager, going on to help the side avoid relegation. Now he's been sacked with all the inevitability that comes after suffering a run of 9 losses in 12 games. The club's statement did find space to thank him and his coaching staff for their service, but they said recent results had forced them to now look for their 6th permanent manager in 5 years. Staying with football, in the Scottish Cup, 6th tier Darvel FC have beaten Premiership side Aberdeen in one of the biggest upsets in the competition's history. The club from East Ayrshire were very much the underdogs in the game, despite being in front of a home crowd. They ran out 1-0 winners to make it through to the last 16. Finally, even for seasoned stars, being cast in a Steven Spielberg film can be a terrifying ordeal. So says Michelle Williams, the 2-time Golden Globe winner. For her, though, the role brought its own particular challenges. Both the knowledge of the director's close connection to the character she played, a veiled depiction of Spielberg's own beloved mother, and the fact that his real-life sisters were standing only metres away.
Sammy? We're going to use Daddy's camera to film it.
It's not every day an actor is asked to play the director's mother. Imagine that director is Steven Spielberg and you start to visualise the mountain that Michelle Williams had to climb.
And cut, beautiful. That was good.
The Fabelmans loosely tells the story of Spielberg's childhood, but the close family connection proved a help rather than a hindrance.
Steven, his sisters were on set every day. He has 3 sisters. They all opened up their memories. You know, having the person who lived through it behind the monitor, you always have like the perfect frame of reference. And you would always hear him say, "I have an idea." And the man has so many ideas. Sammy?
Michelle has now been working in Hollywood for 30 years.
And all of these things, they require effort and they cost more money.
In 2019, she spoke out against the gender pay gap after learning a male co-star earned considerably more than her for film reshoots.
For allowing her to succeed because of her workplace environment and not in spite of it.
Is Hollywood in a better place now, do you think?
It seems to me that there's more transparency. That's the thing that I witness the most often. Which is that there's an understanding now that people will talk and information is communicated and that things can't be hidden in the same way. I am proud to have found my voice in that moment.
Jack, this is my wife, Elma. Howdy.
Hello?
She's no stranger to accolades, her work repeatedly highlighted as among some of the best in the industry.
I don't want to disappoint you.
The Fabelmans is tipped for plenty of Oscar nominations tomorrow, the film lauded by many critics, but Michelle is unlikely to ever see it.
I don't watch my work.
Okay.
So I love what I do, I love acting, and I like to stay connected to the experience that I have on set rather than the finished product, so I haven't watched my work for probably a decade.
When a young Steven Spielberg first picked up a camera, he can't have imagined he'd end up shooting his own story 70 years later. Rishi Davda, News at 10.
And that is all from the News at 10 team for tonight. We will see you tomorrow. Good night.